In August 2007, the Evesham Technology factory in Worcestershire suddenly went quiet. A domestic hardware empire that had defined British computing for decades was placed into administration. Only a few years earlier, this was a company turning over tens of millions of pounds. It dominated the thick pages of PC Pro and personal computer world, supplying hundreds of thousands of bespoke machines to British schools, government offices, and family living rooms. Overnight, the assembly lines stopped. Thousands of custom-built beige towers vanished from local education authority orders, leaving schools scrambling and workers locked out of a business they had helped build. The paradox was striking. Evesham had spent 20 years teaching Britain how to buy technology for the internet age. Yet it was the internet age that had just destroyed it. But the real story of Evesham Micros is not only the story of a bankrupt factory in Worcestershire. It is the story of how Britain used to buy the future on paper and what happened when the future moved online. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, shops, software houses, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Evesham, Worcestershire, in 1983. In 1983, in the quiet Worcestershire market town of Evesham, Richard Austin opened a small business. It was not a sprawling technology campus, and it was not backed by massive venture capital. Initially, the company was not even built around assembling computers. It was built around feeding the machines Britain already had. At the time, the UK was in the grip of the 8-bit home computing boom. Millions of households had bought Sinclair, ZX Spectrums, BBC Micros, and Commodore 64s. Evesham Micros began its life by supplying software for these machines, specifically selling games and utilities on cassette tape. A cassette tape, magnetic tape used by many home computers to load and save programs before disks became standard, was the absolute lifeblood of the early British computing scene. In a typical British bedroom, a pupil would connect a tape recorder to a rubber-keyed Spectrum, press play, and wait 5 minutes as high-pitched audio screeching translated into a playable game on their portable television. It was an accessible, cheap ecosystem, but as the decade progressed, it became clear that it was distinctly amateur. By the late 1980s, the computing landscape began to fracture. The home machines that had taught a generation of British teenagers to code were struggling to adapt to the demands of serious business, professional use, and higher education. The global market was rapidly consolidating around a new, uncompromising standard: the IBM-compatible personal computer. A personal computer, a computer designed for one person to use directly, usually at a desk or in a home, was no longer just a hobbyist's toy. It was becoming the mandatory tool for any functioning modern office. However, there was a massive barrier for the British market. Official IBM machines, or premium alternatives from massive American corporations like Compaq, were formidably expensive. A standard desktop machine could cost a small British business thousands of pounds, placing the digital transition entirely out of reach for many local accounting firms, estate agents, independent shops, and family homes. Richard Austin saw the glaring gap between what the global technology market was producing and what the British buyer could actually afford. He made a crucial pivot that would change the trajectory of his company forever. Evesham Micros would transition from selling 5-pound cassette games to selling high-value professional machines, but crucially, they would not design their own proprietary computer from scratch, as British companies like Acorn or Sinclair had done. Instead, they would become a system builder. To understand the British PC builder market, one must understand the modular nature of the IBM-compatible standard. A computer was no longer a sealed, unchangeable plastic box with a fixed keyboard. It was a collection of distinct, interchangeable components. Evesham began importing these raw parts from the rapidly expanding electronic supply chains in Taiwan and the United States. They bought standard beige metal desktop cases. They sourced motherboards. They imported processors. A processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, dictated exactly how fast a local solicitor could recalculate a spreadsheet or load a client database. They bought memory, fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running, which allowed users to keep multiple documents open without the machine freezing, and they installed hard drives. A hard drive, a storage device that keeps files, software, and operating systems even after power is off, meant that British workers no longer had to endlessly swap fragile floppy disks in and out of a drive just to boot up their word processor. The individual parts were global, but the assembly was entirely domestic. In a growing industrial unit in Worcestershire, British workers stood at static-free assembly benches. They screwed motherboards into metal chassis, routed gray ribbon cables, pushed RAM modules into slots, and installed the MS-DOS operating system by hand. This model offered an incredible structural advantage over the established high street. Traditional retail chains like Dixon's or Curry's sold pre-packaged branded computers that sat in shop windows or on stockroom shelves for months, slowly becoming technologically obsolete before they were even purchased. Evesham, however, built directly to order. If a customer wanted a slightly faster processor or a slightly larger hard drive, the factory could build that exact bespoke specification on a Wednesday and ship it out via courier by Friday. They were agile, running on tight margins, but carrying very little outdated, depreciating stock. Initially, Evesham Micros served the local area, supplying PCs to businesses, schools, and local authorities across the Midlands. But Austin knew that to truly scale the business, the company had to reach the entire country. High street retail space was far too expensive, and dealing with traditional retail middlemen would immediately destroy their pricing advantage. The solution lay in an emerging piece of British media infrastructure that would soon dictate the entire domestic technology market. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, if a British buyer wanted to understand the rapidly moving PC market, they did not go to the internet because the web did not yet exist for the public. They went to the magazine shelves of W.H.S. Smith or John Menzies, and they bought a computer magazine. These thick, glossy publications were becoming the definitive battleground for hardware sales. Evesham Micros began placing small, mail-order adverts in these magazines. The entire premise was built on blind trust. A customer in Scotland, Wales, or Cornwall would read a dense list of technical specifications printed in black and white, pick up a landline telephone, recite their credit card details, or post a check to a sales representative in Worcestershire, and then wait for a lorry to deliver a heavy cardboard box containing a beige computer worth over £1,000. It was a massive gamble. The company was asking British consumers to bypass the traditional, reassuring high street electronics shop entirely, trusting a brand they had only ever seen in print. If the machines arrived broken, if the components were cheap, or if the after-sales support failed, the brand would collapse before it ever truly scaled. But the machines did work. The assembly was solid. The prices severely undercut the global giants, and the telephone support was handled by technicians sitting in the exact same British town where the computers were built. The parts were global, but the assembly was British, and Evesham was about to discover exactly how to sell that combination to a country waiting to connect. The assembly line in Worcestershire was ready, but having the capacity to build a machine was only half the battle. The true breakthrough for Evesham Micros did not come from inventing a new type of silicon chip or designing a revolutionary motherboard. It came from mastering a completely different kind of infrastructure, the British Computer Magazine. In the early to mid-1990s, if a household in Leeds, a student in Edinburgh, or a small business in Cardiff wanted to buy a personal computer, they did not open a web browser. The internet was still a niche, dial-up novelty for academics and early enthusiasts. Instead, the British buyer walked into a W.H. Smith or a John Menzies, went to the magazine shelf, and bought a physical publication. Titles like PC Pro, Personal Computer World, Computer Shopper, and later Custom PC were massive, heavy volumes, sometimes running to 300 pages. They were not merely magazines. They were the paper high street of the British technology industry. For a regional system builder like Evesham, this paper high street was the ultimate equalizer. They did not need to pay astronomical rents for glass-fronted shops in central London, nor did they need to surrender half their profit margins to high street retail chains like Dixon's or Comet. They simply needed to buy advertising space. But Evesham did not buy small hidden squares in the back pages. They began taking out massive multi-page full-color spreads. These adverts were dense, intimidating walls of text and numbers, listing processor speeds, RAM configurations, monitor sizes, and software bundles. To the modern eye, they look like chaotic spreadsheets, but to the British consumer of the 1990s, they were a catalog of the future. The entire business model relied on a very specific Sunday morning ritual. A buyer would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, a biro, and a copy of Computer Shopper, physically circling different specifications, trying to balance their budget against their desire for processing power. But buying advertising space was only the visible layer of the ecosystem. The true tension in this market lay in the editorial reviews. A mail-order brand lived or died by the gold, silver, or bronze award logos it could print on its adverts. Every month, Evesham would send their latest custom-built tower to the testing labs of PC Pro or Personal Computer World. If the magazine's journalists found that the machine ran too hot, if the motherboard was unstable, or if the graphics card underperformed, a bad review would be printed. In the mail-order era, a single bad review could instantly wipe out a month's worth of sales because the magazine was the only source of truth the buyer had. Fortunately for Evesham, their machines consistently won. They built a reputation for using high-quality, branded components rather than cheap, unbranded substitutes that often plagued the budget PC market. This reputation collided perfectly with the most important software shift of the decade. In August 1995, the technology market was irreversibly changed by the launch of Windows 95. Microsoft's new operating system transformed the personal computer from a gray, text-heavy box into a vibrant, graphical multimedia machine. But to run this new world effectively, users needed hardware upgrades. They needed CD-ROM drives, optical disc readers that held vast amounts of data, allowing computers to play high-quality audio, video, and complex encyclopedias like Microsoft Encarta. They needed sound cards, and they needed much more memory. The high-street retail chains were often slow to react, selling older stock that struggled to run the new multimedia software. Evesham, building to order in Worcestershire, adapted instantly. They began aggressively marketing multimedia PCs, heavily featuring CD-ROMs and large monitors. This created a fascinating psychological shift in how the British public bought technology. A family was now willing to pick up a landline telephone, dial a number in the Midlands, and read their credit card details to a stranger to spend upwards of £1,000 or £1,500. They were buying a beige box they had never physically touched, built by a company they had never visited, based entirely on a glowing review in a magazine and a picture on a page. When the phone rang in the Evesham call center, a deeply efficient logistical machine woke up. The sales representative would note the exact requested specification. The order was passed to the factory floor. The metal chassis was pulled from the warehouse. The specific processor and memory modules were slotted into the motherboard. The cables were tied. The machine was booted up, tested, packed into a heavy cardboard box, and handed to a courier. A few days later, a white van would pull up outside a suburban British home. The heavy box was carried into the living room. The polystyrene packaging was torn away, and the machine was plugged in. It was a domestic ritual that defined a generation of British technology adoption. Evesham had proved that the physical high street could be entirely bypassed if the assembly was solid, the reviews were excellent, and the phone was always answered. The magazine page had built the brand. Now Evesham had to prove it could supply a nation stepping into the internet age. By the turn of the millennium, the small operation that had once sold cassette tapes for the ZX Spectrum had transformed into a sprawling, multi-million-pound industrial machine. The company dropped its 1980s moniker, Evesham Micros, and rebranded simply as Evesham Technology. This was not just a change of stationery, it was a declaration of scale. The British market was hungry for computing power, and the factory in Worcestershire was perfectly positioned to feed it. The sheer volume of beige metal leaving the Midlands was staggering. At its absolute peak in the early 2000s, Evesham Technology was generating annual revenues approaching $100 million. They were no longer just a niche mail-order company for hardware enthusiasts who read custom PC or PC Shopper. They had broken out of the magazine pages and begun to physically construct the digital infrastructure of the United Kingdom. If you walked into a British secondary school or a local comprehensive at the dawn of the 21st century, the computing environment was rapidly changing. The beloved Acorn Archimedes and BBC Micros of the 1980s and early 1990s were being aggressively cleared out of classrooms. In their place came the school ICT room, a dedicated computer room filled with rows of identical desktop PCs, thick CRT monitors, and tangled gray mice. For local education authorities across the country, Evesham was an incredibly attractive supplier. Schools needed Windows-based machines to teach modern software, but they could not afford the massive markups of international corporate brands. Because Evesham built directly to order, they could supply a council with 500 identical, aggressively priced networked PCs, complete with a robust British warranty. Consequently, an entire generation of British pupils learned to navigate the internet, type coursework, and secretly play flash games on Evesham machines. The brand was suddenly everywhere. It was on the desks of the Ministry of Defense, it was powering local council administrative offices, and it was sitting in the corner of NHS clinics. But the most important battleground remained the British living room. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw the rapid rollout of broadband, a high-speed internet connection that remained permanently on, eliminating the need to tie up the household landline. Broadband required more powerful machines, capable of running heavier web browsers, displaying complex media, and downloading larger files. Evesham capitalized on this aggressively. They expanded their footprint by opening a network of physical retail showrooms in towns and cities across the UK, from Birmingham to Norwich. These were not traditional high street shops with shelves of boxed software like Dixon's or PC World. They were sparse, functional showrooms where families could test a keyboard, look at a monitor, and then sit down with a sales representative to order a custom-built machine that would be assembled back in Worcestershire. Every month, publications like Personal Computer World and PC Pro handed them Best Buy accolades. The factory had to source massive quantities of components to keep up with the demand. They bought high-end graphics cards for the growing PC gaming market, massive hard drives for storing MP3 files, and the latest Intel Pentium processors. A processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, was the headline of every magazine advert, often dictating how long a machine would remain useful before becoming obsolete. In a British home where a single computer might serve an entire family, the purchase of an Evesham tower was a major financial and cultural event. It did not merely run software. It decided who first saw the internet as a daily habit, who discovered digital work beyond the high street, and who felt that the future had finally entered their home. Evesham was no longer just building computers, it was building the infrastructure of digital Britain. The brand had found its ultimate scale, but the greatest catalyst for their revenue was a specific government intervention that would soon push the factory to its absolute limits and ultimately set the stage for its destruction. The engine that drove this final, monumental surge in scale was the Home Computing Initiative, or HCI. Introduced by the UK government, the HCI scheme was designed to increase digital literacy across the country. It allowed British employees to purchase a computer tax-free through a salary sacrifice scheme, meaning the cost was simply deducted from their wages before tax over a period of years. For Evesham Technology, this government program was the ultimate accelerator. Suddenly, the company was no longer just selling to the hardware enthusiasts who studied benchmarks in Custom PC Magazine. They were selling to NHS nurses, factory floor workers, council staff, and teachers who were bringing a personal computer into their home for the very first time. Evesham aggressively targeted the corporate partners running these HCI schemes, positioning themselves as the safe, reliable, British-built option. The Worcestershire factory had to expand massively to meet the demand. At its peak, the company employed over 300 people in the local area. Lorry after lorry departed the industrial estate, carrying hundreds of identical cardboard boxes into the British logistical network. Evesham opened more retail units, expanding their high street presence to 22 stores across the UK. They were manufacturing laptops, media center PCs designed to sit under the living room television, and even flat-screen TVs, desperately trying to capture every corner of the British digital home. This period represents the absolute peak of the domestic system builder. In a British home where a single computer might serve an entire family, the arrival of an Evesham tower was a major cultural event. It did not merely run software. It was the specific machine where a teenager learned to navigate early social networks, where a parent tentatively sent their first email, where coursework was printed late on a Sunday night, and where the family first experienced the permanent connection of broadband. The brand had woven itself into the fabric of daily British life. Evesham had successfully transitioned from a small mail-order outfit selling ZX Spectrum tapes into a national technology institution. They had won the magazine wars, they had won the school contracts, and they had won the government's trust. By 2005, Evesham Technology stood at the absolute summit of the British hardware market, moving hundreds of thousands of machines across the country. But the ground beneath the assembly line was already beginning to fracture. The first crack was almost invisible. In the mid-2000s, the Evesham factory was still shipping thousands of units. The computer magazines still carried their dense multi-page adverts. The 22 high street showrooms were still open. But the way the British public found, evaluated, and bought technology was fundamentally shifting. The very infrastructure that Evesham had spent a decade supplying to the nation, the internet, was beginning to dismantle their original business model. The market force at play was a brutal combination of global scale and convenience displacement. For a decade, Evesham's absolute strength was the mail-order catalog model, driven by print media. But as broadband penetrated the British home, the Sunday morning ritual of circling specifications in personal computer world was gradually replaced by the search engine, an online service that indexes the web and helps users find information. Buyers no longer needed to wait for a monthly magazine to tell them which machine to buy. They no longer needed to trust a printed page or call a landline number in Worcestershire. They could simply open a browser, compare specifications across a dozen different manufacturers in seconds, and order a machine online. Waiting on the other side of that search engine was an American giant that had weaponized Evesham's exact business model. Dell did not rely on traditional, physical high street shops either. They also built their machines directly to order, cutting out the middlemen. But while Evesham bought processors, memory, and hard drives by the thousand to supply the United Kingdom, Dell bought them by the million to supply the world. This vast, global purchasing power allowed the American corporation to aggressively slash hardware prices, plunging the British market into a race to the bottom. In the late 1990s, a respectable desktop tower might have cost a British family £1,200, leaving a healthy, sustainable profit margin for the assembly plant in the Midlands. By the mid-2000s, that same tier of everyday computing power was being sold for under £400. The margins on raw hardware collapsed. Evesham was suddenly burdened with the heavy overheads of a massive domestic factory, a local technical support call center, and a network of physical retail showrooms, all while trying to compete against an utterly ruthless global logistics network. The British builder could no longer win on price. Compounding this financial squeeze was a physical shift in the machines themselves. The consumer market was moving rapidly away from the traditional, heavy beige desktop tower and toward the laptop, a portable personal computer containing a battery, keyboard, and screen in a single folding unit. For a custom system builder, the laptop was an existential threat. Desktop PCs were inherently modular. Evesham could easily buy empty metal cases, slot in specific motherboards, add varying amounts of RAM, and wire it all together on a British workbench. Laptops, however, were highly integrated, proprietary pieces of engineering. They were designed, molded, and assembled in massive, highly efficient factories in Asia. Evesham could no longer add meaningful value through bespoke British assembly. They were increasingly reduced to simply importing finished, generic laptops, sticking an Evesham badge on the plastic lid, and trying to sell them at a markup. The unique British assembly line, which had been the company's core identity, was becoming irrelevant to the modern buyer who just wanted to browse the web from the living room sofa. Sensing these rapidly shrinking margins in traditional desktop computing, the company attempted a desperate retreat into other categories of consumer electronics. They started putting the trusted Evesham name on LCD televisions, digital cameras, and satellite navigation units for cars. It was a classic case of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products or services that no longer reflect the original promise. The Evesham logo, once a gold standard guarantee of bespoke, high-performance computing components carefully chosen and tested by British technicians, was now printed on generic consumer electronics, competing in crowded supermarket aisles. The financial pressure across the business was becoming severe, but the company was not yet broken. The Worcestershire assembly line was still moving, artificially insulated by the massive, guaranteed volume of corporate and educational orders flowing from the government's home computing initiative. Evesham had built its entire short-term survival strategy around this public service program continuing. Then, without warning, the government changed the rules. In the spring of 2006, the British government delivered a fatal, untelegraphed blow to the domestic computing industry. Chancellor Gordon Brown stood up to deliver the annual budget. Buried within the financial legislation was the sudden, immediate withdrawal of the tax exemption that made the home computing initiative possible. The political argument was that the scheme had drifted from its original goal of improving digital literacy, instead becoming a heavily subsidized loophole for wealthy households to buy second or third luxury laptops at the taxpayer's expense. The political debate raged in London, but in Worcestershire, the consequences were instant and absolute. The massive corporate and educational partnerships that drove Evesham's volume simply evaporated overnight. The salary sacrifice scheme was dead. The bulk orders for hundreds of identical classroom desktops stopped completely. The steady guaranteed revenue stream that had insulated the British factory from the brutal reality of global price wars was severed without warning. Evesham was suddenly entirely exposed to the crushing weight of global scale and convenience displacement. The company found itself trapped in a fatal logistical bind. Over the previous 2 years, they had vastly expanded their workforce, signed long-term leases on new high-street showrooms, and ordered millions of pounds worth of components based entirely on the assumption that government-backed contracts would continue. Now they were sitting on massive stockpiles of depreciating hardware. In the technology market, a processor or a graphics card loses value every single month. Evesham no longer had the customer volume to clear the stock before it became technologically obsolete. The physical retreat of the brand was rapid and highly visible to the British public. The company began systematically closing its network of 22 physical showrooms, abandoning the high streets they had fought so hard to conquer. The massive, glossy, multi-page adverts in PC Pro and personal computer world shrank to fractions of a page and then disappeared entirely. By August 2007, the financial pressure broke the company. The assembly line in Worcestershire fell silent. Evesham Technology collapsed into administration. The workers who had built the digital infrastructure of British schools and living rooms were locked out. What followed was a chaotic and controversial final chapter. In a desperate bid to keep the name alive, the remaining assets were bought out of administration by Evesham Technology, a company heavily linked to the founders of Time Group. Time Computers had been another massive British PC builder, famous for aggressive, budget-focused Sunday newspaper adverts, before it too had collapsed. For the British hardware enthusiast, it was a bitter conclusion. Evesham, the premium, multi-award-winning system builder, was now in the hands of the budget market. This new ownership structure attempted to run the brand, but the core identity of Evesham, the trusted, high-quality, bespoke British assembly line with impeccable local customer support, was entirely gone. The new operation was drastically smaller, deeply indebted, and fundamentally misaligned with a market that had already moved on to cheap global laptops and emerging smartphone screens. The brand had suffered catastrophic dilution. The logo remained, but the trust that took 20 years to build across the magazine pages of Britain was shattered. Within a year, the rescue attempt failed completely. In 2008, the resurrected company was formally liquidated. The factory doors were locked. The remaining stock was cleared. The magazine pages moved on. The schools bought global laptops. The assembly line was dismantled. The high street shop sat empty. The Evesham logo lost its meaning. The British builder era was over. The collapse of Evesham Technology in 2008 left a very specific kind of ghost in the British market. When a software house dies, its code can be digitally archived. When a pioneer like Acorn or Sinclair collapses, their unique machines are preserved in glass cases at the National Museum of Computing, revered as foundational moments in British engineering. But Evesham was a system builder. They did not invent a new proprietary operating system or design a revolutionary silicon chip. They took global components, standard processors, memory modules, and motherboards, and assembled them in a British factory for the British public. Consequently, the preservation of an Evesham computer today looks very different from the preservation of a BBC Micro. You do not typically find an Evesham beige tower under the bright spotlights of a museum exhibition. Instead, their legacy survives in the quiet, dusty corners of the country. If you want to find an Evesham machine today, you must look in car boot sales, deep within the listings of eBay, or on the crowded shelves of charity shops. In vintage computing forums and on retro technology restoration channels, a dedicated community of enthusiasts still hunts for these machines. They rescue heavy, yellowing metal cases from e-waste bins. They carefully clean the dust from the motherboard slots, reconnect the thick gray ribbon cables, and listen for the distinct, mechanical grind of the hard drive booting up Windows 95 or Windows XP. But this survival is not merely nostalgia for old, noisy hardware. It passes a much stricter historical test. An Evesham tower sitting on a collector's desk is a physical argument about a vanished era of technological agency. Today, when a British consumer buys a computer, they are almost entirely purchasing a sealed, unchangeable slab of glass and aluminium from a global megacorporation. Modern laptops and tablets are integrated appliances. Their memory is soldered to the board, their batteries are glued in place, and their assembly happens in vast anonymous factories thousands of miles away. An Evesham computer proves that a different relationship with technology once existed. It is a physical reminder of a time when the British public had direct input into the machines they bought. A customer sat with a computer magazine, studied the specifications, decided exactly how much RAM they could afford, and then a worker in Worcestershire physically screwed that exact machine together. Buying an Evesham was not just a transaction, it was a bespoke domestic partnership between the user and the builder. There is a surprising footnote to this collapse. The act of choosing components and building a custom desktop PC did not disappear completely. Today it thrives as a highly lucrative, niche hobby for PC gamers and extreme hardware enthusiasts. But what Evesham represented was something entirely different. They brought custom, built-to-order hardware to the absolute mainstream. They built the machines that ran local council accounting software. They built the towers that sat in comprehensive school ICT rooms. They built the family PC that first connected to a broadband modem. That mass-market domestic assembly line, where bespoke technology was the standard for ordinary households, is what vanished forever. The fall of Evesham Technology perfectly illustrates the brutal, unforgiving nature of global scale and convenience displacement. The company did not fail because they built bad machines. They failed because the entire infrastructure they relied upon was systematically dismantled by the very internet they helped their customers access. Evesham was the undisputed titan of the paper high street. They mastered the art of the multi-page magazine advert. But when the internet matured, the British consumers stopped buying thick computer magazines to compare processor speeds. They simply opened a browser and went straight to Dell. Evesham could not survive the financial gravity of globalized, commoditized manufacturing. When the British government abruptly withdrew the home computing initiative in 2006, it simply removed the final artificial pillar holding up a business model that belonged to an earlier decade. The transition was absolute. The local education authorities switched their purchasing contracts to cheap, generic laptops from global giants. The 22 Evesham showrooms on the British High Street were shuttered, their leases handed over to coffee shops and mobile phone retailers. The vast assembly floor in Worcestershire was emptied, ending a quarter-century of British computer manufacturing in the town. Britain did not stop buying computers. It simply stopped buying them from a catalog, and it stopped demanding they be built at home. The market moved towards the absolute convenience of the sealed global device, leaving the domestic system builder behind. Somewhere in a British loft, pushed to the back behind boxes of old VHS tapes and forgotten photo albums, an Evesham PC still sits in the dark. The heavy metal chassis is cool to the touch, the beige plastic front panel has slightly yellowed with age, and the familiar logo still catches the faint light. It is silent now, waiting patiently for a heavy CRT monitor and a dial-up connection that will never return, a perfect physical monument to the days when Britain still built the future to order. See you in the next one.